Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, basically what I'm going to do is try and answer some of your questions arising from the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill that has now been published by the government. Several people have got lots of questions about it. But first, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So first of all, let me be clear, I'm not a legal expert. Second of all, just like anyone else, I have only had since last night to read this, and I have not stayed up all night by candlelight reading it through and writing lots of notes about it. I've written some. I've read it once, written some notes about things that I thought, ooh, that sounds interesting. However, there's a reason why it's not reasonable to be able to answer all questions in this amount of time, and that's because it's quite complex and there's a lot of it. And another thing as well, we talk about, there's 110 pages. A lot of those pages refer to other pieces of legislation and other documents as well, including the withdrawal agreement. So you actually have to cross-reference it with a lot of things to get a full understanding, and I haven't been doing all that either. And this is why even a former member of Boris Johnson's team was saying that it's going to take 4 weeks to go through this. You can't do it in 3 days. It's not possible. But anyway, there are some questions I can answer. I shall do my very best. We'll start off with the first one. First one says, I have a feeling that in the end, the UK will just end up staying in the customs union. Now, inevitably, yes, I have to agree with this for the simple reason that we need one. You know, the argument about, we can do without, I mean, you know, first of all, let's be clear about this. If we leave with the no deal cliff edge, then it's not that we have zero trade with the EU from that point. It's just that we have much less because we are less competitive. In fact, we have to bear in mind we've already lost a lot of trade before we've even left. And the reason for that is there are businesses in non-UK EU member states that do not want to be left in a situation where all of a sudden their supplier is not able to get goods to them, because then that affects their business. So there's quite a lot of businesses have already switched supplier away from UK businesses to other ones. So those businesses have already been buggered. There are obviously international companies that have plants, factories in the UK that have already committed to moving those out as well. There was investment, even on the part of some British companies, where they were holding on, then they had to make their decision and decided to put that investment elsewhere as well. So that's already happened. But more of it will, of course, happen. So yeah, in order to be able to claw back some of that business, we are inevitably going to have to commit to a customs union. Whether that is before we leave or whether that is afterwards and then all of a sudden everyone realises just how bad the situation was, I don't know. But the notion that we can just pick up trade elsewhere in the world is ridiculous. I mean, there's two obvious ways to shoot that argument down. One of which is those markets don't exist. Do they think there are markets in the world just waiting to buy British goods? Why aren't they buying them now? If they want them now, they can buy them now. The fact is they're not. And in fact, in quite a lot of those other markets, they've been scaling back. The other thing is you get some ridiculous people saying things like, go to the Commonwealth. We were, we still are a member of the Commonwealth, but that was our focus. When the EEC was being formed, Britain's focus was the Commonwealth. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a video that's be coming out at some point. I don't know what to say when, about Churchill's attitude to it all. But we moved away from that because the EEC was a bigger trading bloc and also politically going to be more powerful as well. The Commonwealth has a way smaller GDP. And there isn't, even if they all of a sudden wanted to expand and import a load of British goods, they can't possibly do it to the same tune. There isn't the money to do it. They ain't got the money to buy it to the same tune that the EU do. So yeah, we are going to have to get into a customs union. Next question says, could the text of this bill persuade enough Labour MPs who ideologically can never greenlight lowering even the possibility of lowering standards? I think you might have got that. Anyway, to change their mind. So basically what this is saying is there are some Labour MPs that were going to vote for this deal. When they see that it's going to lower standards, will they change their mind? No. The MPs who were going to vote for this deal are doing so for political purposes, not ideological purposes. They're putting themselves ahead of the nation's interests and their constituents' interests, for fear of what the constituents will think, because some constituents do not necessarily know what's in their interest. I'm not trying to be patronising there, that's just the way it is. However, what it could do, and the other thing I'll just add in here as well, I've tweeted about this today. So there's at least one Labour MP, there'll be quite a lot that have done this, but at least one Labour MP has been perfectly open and honest in saying they've not even read it, but they're still going to vote for it. Now, it has to be said, with most pieces of legislation, with most bills, most MPs do not read them anyway. Reason? Is it just because they're lazy? No, it's because they're being told how to vote anyway by their parties. However, this is such a major issue, and also for a Labour MP, well, your party's not telling you to vote for this blindly anyway. But what this may do for those Labour MPs, because as I was talking about yesterday, there are some Labour MPs who, putting themselves first, want to vote for this. But they're not going to feel good about it. Bless. So what they would prefer to do is to vote for it with amendments that take the sting out of the tail. If there's any way in which they can get rid of some of the worst aspects of what this bill will eventually lead to for the country, whereupon they will be blamed. They know later on they're going to, they're going to suffer for this. They're just thinking short term. Then they will do that. So it may not cause them to vote against the bill, but what it is probably going to do is get them to vote for amendments, not necessarily the referendum amendment, but at least amendments that take the sting out of the tail. And those amendments, as indicated by the cartoon behind me, may be enough for Boris Johnson to decide. If those amendments are enough to make it very difficult or impossible for him to get his no deal, he may sink the whole thing himself and wait until after the general election. So that's what I think there. It won't get them to vote against the bill. It probably will get them to vote for amendments. The next one, it says, his deal also has to be economically assessed. Sajid Javid, who is the Chancellor, refuses to do so. No wonder why. I mean, the thing as well, it's not just that Sajid Javid has refused to release an economic impact statement, which Parliament has asked for and has every right to have, and indeed you should have with anything, any bill like this. I would bet that he hasn't even done it. Now, I get the impression he hasn't even done it. And the thing is, it wouldn't, it's not like there's an argument for, it'll take ages to do it. We haven't got the time. We need to get this through. That's not it. Civil servants, there was like this cross-departmental group that spent months developing a model that you could use to update, to work out the economic impact of whatever deal. So he's got that tool available to him. And I get the impression he hasn't used it. So I don't think they've used it at all. Because I think the danger is, if he used it, and actually there was an economic impact statement, Parliament could demand they hand it over. Whereas Parliament can't demand they hand over what doesn't exist. So I don't think they've even done it. I don't think they even want to know themselves. That's how irresponsible our ministers are behaving at the moment. So yeah, it's possible there does not exist anywhere for anyone's eyes the economic impact of this deal or this bill. Next one, it says, so you've downloaded it, some bedtime reading. If you have or get links to the main points to help us understand a bit more, that would be great. Well, I mean, I'm a pleb myself, but okay, I noted down some pages. I'll go through some. Remember my earlier statement, I'm not a legal expert and I have only had a small amount of time to go through this. Which means I've spent more effort on it than most MPs, but still. So page numbers that I thought were interesting. And again, not legal expert. Page 30 on jurisdiction. Though on that page you'll notice it has to be cross-referenced with other sections and even other documents. But that's the bit about acknowledging the jurisdiction of the European courts for certain areas. Page 38 and 39 on what the transition period is sets the date and time at 31st of December 2020, 11 p.m. UK time. That is the point at which we leave without a deal. On page 33 on extending the transition period. Now, you'll notice in there, although Parliament has to approve the extension, it is a minister that decides whether or not to seek one. So if the government don't want an extension, the process never begins. It starts and ends with the minister. Parliament cannot intervene with that, with this bill. Now, obviously, as we already know, Parliament is sovereign. It could always amend this bill to give it a role in that, a bigger role than simply, rubber stamping it for the minister. Or it could legislate in the future. Parliament can legislate to amend, bills, acts there'll be once they're in law at any time. So they would be able to do that, but they would have to do that. So what I'm saying is, with this bill as it is, it's a minister that decides whether we extend or not. Page 85 doesn't need a huge amount of scrutiny as such, but it's just political minefield, really. It's obvious this sort of thing would be there in terms of having to amend existing acts. So two of them, of course, the amendment of the European Economic Area Act, which just brings it home as to just how much difficulty we're going to have with trade and services, goods and services, after this transition period ends. But also, and this is what the Scottish Parliament will be up in arms about, the amendment of the Scotland Act. Now, even though the Scottish Parliament is devolved to deal with purely Scottish matters, and Westminster still decides UK-wide matters, and obviously Brexit is a UK-wide issue, and therefore Westminster's, just the process of changing the Scotland Act will give... this is the thing that gave rise to the devolved Scottish Parliament in the first place. So doing that without the approval of the Scottish Parliament will give a lot of political ammunition to the SNP. And this is the page that will, in my opinion, destroy the union if Brexit happens. And will still be used for political capital, which could still sink the union even if we don't ultimately leave. So, next one. Last couple. Last few. So, says here, this is the Brexiteer point of view. Not everyone knows what the future shape of the EU will be. Now, I'll read the rest of it. I'll just stop it there. This is the classic Brexiteer, no one knows what the future holds. But again, you come back to, so you voted for something you don't know. But anyway, we'll go for it says, more worryingly, some like Phil even deny what the key players of the EU project, Verhofstadt, Juncker, Macron, etc., are saying about what they foresee, namely a federal EU government, single taxation policy and shared responsibility for EU banking debt. I can imagine millennials enjoying adding that to their student loans. Right, here we go. First of all, I have never denied what any of those people have said they see for the future of Europe. However, here is the thing. Inside of Europe, let's take those one at a time. Federal EU government cannot happen without the UK's approval. Can happen without the UK's approval if we're not a member. Single taxation policy. No, the only single taxation policy there is on VAT, and actually, whose fault is that? Ours. That was the UK that said there should be one and set the minimum value for it. Shared responsibility for EU banking debt. Again, no. That is only for the Eurozone. Now, of course, if we leave, and if we leave, we will eventually need to go back in, and we adopt the euro, we'll be part of the Eurozone, then we will have shared responsibility for EU banking debts. That is the only circumstance. So only by leaving can we ever have shared responsibility for EU banking debts, unless, of course, the UK government approves of it. Which, because again, veto. So these are all nonsense. These may be what some individuals in the EU would like to see for the future of the EU. And I notice that two of the names he's mentioned as wanting that are leaving their posts imminently. One has basically already left, pretty much. So that's irrelevant anyway. But also, it's like the issue of extending Article 50, where a single member state can say, no. The same thing applies to this. Single member state can say, no, we don't want that. And that's all there is to it. So none of these things can happen if the UK doesn't want them. If the UK is a member, none of them will happen even if the UK isn't, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, because there are other nations that also don't. All of these things have been trolled up before, and there are plenty of nations that don't want these either. Obviously, if you look at some of these things, I mean, you talk about Macron, yeah. But again, there are some of these things that are in the interests of France. But they're not in the interests of other nations, and they would veto them as well. However, If we weren't a member, if we left, then all of them in theory could happen without the UK's approval, and then that means we have to accept them when we go back in, which we inevitably will. So that's absolute nonsense, and that is a statement of objective fact, because none of those things can happen if the UK is a member if we don't want them. Next one. So Brexiteers complained that the Benn Act was rushed through Parliament in a couple of days. In fact, actually, the Benn Act took 4 days. Longer than Boris Johnson wants to take this. And that was much shorter and much easier to understand. And it didn't cross-reference to loads of other things as well. It says, but now it's okay to do the same with the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Of course, because they are utter hypocrites. The Brexiteers in Parliament, it's not to say all Leave supporters, but the Brexiteers in Parliament, and I will even say they're not all of them. I mean, we know, we could hear just yesterday with the debates, some of them were reasonable people, some of them are not. So again, let's not tar everyone with the same brush. But there are a number of them, shall I say, that are utter hypocrites, complete and utter hypocrites every time. Just like when yesterday they were banging on about the bias of John Bercow again, and he had to come back and say, look at all of the urgent questions, emergency debates and motions from backbenchers I have allowed from you guys. Complete and utter hypocrites. They have no shame, basically. They are the dirtiest of all politicians. And they have absolutely no shame. And they do not care about honour. They do not care who they hurt to get what they want. And what they want is simply more money. And that's all it comes down to. And then the last one says, you are right, it's an agreement, but it has the characteristics of a deal, a trade deal in brackets there. When the EU customs union is in it, like in May's deal, because this would make any additional trade negotiations post-Brexit unnecessary. And that's why EU laws say you must finish the withdrawal and then further negotiations take place because the agreement dictates what and how much must be negotiated later. So the first point there, has the characteristics of a trade deal? No, it doesn't. Or any deal. It doesn't at all. In fact, the word trade isn't even mentioned in it. A trade deal contains lists of commodities. You know, when we have to, and this is what I mean about the length of time it takes to negotiate a trade deal. When you're negotiating a trade deal, you have to consider every single item of goods and services, if you're including that, and you bloody well want to, we want to, that we may possibly wish to trade between us and the EU. They all have to be considered because we have to agree on both sides what tariffs, if any, should apply and what quotas, if any, should apply. You know, and that for everything that the UK could possibly be producing or want to trade in either direction, it all has to be considered on an individual basis. None of this contains any of that. That would all have to be determined later on. How the hell is that going to be done in a year? Now, people will be saying, oh, we could just have a free trade agreement. Yeah, okay, yes. We can basically say we would like to remain part of the single market in the same way that Norway is. We will pay a fee for that, which will be greater than our EU membership, because proportionally it is for Norway. Proportionally, Norway pay a larger fee to the EU for access to the single market than they would a membership fee, you know, than they would do if we look at it proportionally than we do as our membership fee. And just to be clear about that, they don't pay more than us, they pay proportionally more than us. And we access to the single market, which means we accept all of their standards and rules, and we accept the European Court's jurisdiction over any issues that are related to that trade. We can do that. That won't take long. If we want to do that, yeah, if we want to accept all of the EU rules, every single one of them, and pay a large amount of money for it, more than we currently pay as members, but unlike as members, have zero say over those rules at all. Zero. Yeah, we can do that. That is the only way it can be done in a year. So that, I mean, that's the reality of the situation, whether people understand that or not, whether people choose to accept that or not. That is the reality. You either have the Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, which basically means, can we be a member of the single market and not a member of the EU? Yeah, you can pay a fortune for it and accept all our rules. Or you have a more comprehensive trade agreement that, you know, you have to pick every individual goods and service and consider them all on an individual basis, which takes bloody years. It's one or the other. One or the other. Johnson is not going to go for the first, and even if he wanted to go for the second, which he doesn't, he can't in the time allowed, so it's still a no-deal Brexit. And that's all there is to it. So hopefully that's answered what I can. Hopefully that does answer some questions. Hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.